We have talked about ideas where ocean CDR, ocean carbon dioxide removal, means enhancing ocean's natural ability to take up carbon, and that has included things like growing algae or enhanced alkalinity and so on. The other idea is to then remember that the ocean naturally takes up so much of the carbon. Anywhere from 25 to 40% of the carbon is taken up by the ocean. There are sources and sinks, but net sink of the ocean is of that order. So ocean also holds about 100 times as much CO2 as the atmosphere. Can we just then take out CO2 from the ocean so that the oceans continue to take CO2 from the atmosphere? Because the problem with taking out CO2 from the atmosphere, as we have discussed, is that the concentration is 0.04%, which is very small. So you have to recycle or flow through a lot of air or compress a lot of air to get sufficient amount of CO2 to remove. And then that comes down to whether we have enough, how much energy it uses, what the cost will be, and so on and so forth. So the MIT team now makes a claim that they can directly capture carbon from seawater and not from air. So this is one of the images. So MIT proposes mobile seawater carbon capture plants on boats. So imagine just being out there in the open ocean and just taking out CO2, collecting it, and then of course you have to do the sequestration or utilization as before. Just to look at some background, this is the annual report put out by the Global Carbon Budget, typically led by Pierre Friedlingstein. And it shows going from 1850 to the end of 2022, how I think it goes to end of 2021. You have to just check. I think it says 2022, so it must go to 2022. It's showing the various sources and sinks, and the main point I want you to note is that the ocean sink here has continued to increase. So ocean right now takes up 35 to 40%, and of course the worry is that with the ocean warming, the reduced solubility and also wind changes, etc., whether ocean will begin to saturate or begin to be a weaker sink than it has been. So we'll have to watch out for that. And we have also talked about increased CO2 in the atmosphere leading to acidification in the ocean and so on, which are also some issues that are very critical for ecosystems. And there is the cumulative emissions. Of course, you can again see that the ocean has taken out a substantial amount of CO2 over that period since Industrial Revolution. Just as a recap, this is a schematic from World Resources Institute. Potential approaches to storing carbon in the ocean. So this is storing carbon in the ocean as opposed to taking out carbon from the ocean and asking it to take out more from the atmosphere, which is much easier for the ocean because it covers 70% of the surface area and has a natural ability to do that. Ocean is buffered in the sense it doesn't get saturated with CO2 because CO2 is easily soluble in water, but that CO2 then gets moved into bicarbonate and carbonate ions, and various uptakes happen, calcium carbonate forming animals and species and so on. So ocean continues to take up more CO2 than its saturation capacity. So biological, leveraging photosynthesis to capture more carbon through restoring coastal ecosystems that store carbon, large-scale seaweed cultivation, and ocean iron fertilization. We have discussed all these elsewhere, so you can look up. Chemically, adding alkalinity to store CO2 as dissolved solid minerals. So the alkalinity of the ocean determines its ability to take up CO2. Adding carbonate or silicate minerals to the ocean can help that. Adding silicate minerals to coastal areas is easier since we don't have to go taking shiploads of silica into the middle of the ocean. Using minerals from desalination plant reject brine. So desalination is already growing everywhere. Israel, for example, solved a lot of its water problems by simply desalinizing ocean water, and those plants produce enormous amount of brine, the salt that's taken out of the water when desalination happens. That can be used to enhance alkalinity as well. Electrochemically, using electricity to accelerate chemical reactions that store carbon. So seawater electrolysis, and seawater electrolysis can include hydrogen production as well. So can we split seawater then to induce carbon uptake or storage of carbon as well as producing H2? These are great ideas, and hopefully sometime they will become scalable and economical. Possible uses and benefits of cultivated macroalgae, just from WRI again. Macroalgae or seaweed for emissions reduction or carbon removal. You have potential uses and benefits. So animal feed, which reduces methane for ruminant animals, can substitute for wild caught fish for aquaculture feed. Low carbon protein can substitute for protein sources with higher CO2 intensities. So already a lot of seaweed gets used in some Asian countries like China and Japan. Biofuel could replace some conventional fossil fuels and ease the pressure on land and the competition with food and competition with food security and biofuel, for example. Soil amendment, seaweed biochar or compost could substitute for synthetic fertilizers. Biochar is always a good way to add carbon to the soil, which enhances its productivity, soil moisture retention capacity, nutrient retention, erosion reduction, and so on. Deep ocean sinking, no beneficial use here, but largest net carbon removal benefit can occur from sinking, growing algae, and then finding a way to sink them to the bottom. Coming back to MIT, the system could be integrated with any existing infrastructure that processes seawater, such as desalination plant. So this is a schematic showing some sort of a renewable energy driving some of the processes. So you always have to worry about how much energy these things use, so that you actually are removing scalable amount of CO2 eventually, and sequestering it, and not using more energy to produce or run these CO2 sequestrations than the amount of CO2 you would sequester, as opposed to the CO2 emissions from the energy production. So renewable energies are always a good source. Just briefly, this is showing the schematic of the device. In general, this has been tried before. There is usually one membrane. There is lots of energy required for extracting salt and removing CO2 from them, and so on and so forth. So this is showing optimizing current density and electrode gap. So you are seeing various salt elements here that are using ocean water that is pumped in with oxygen and nitrogen removed for running these things, because you don't want them to run through the system. Then there is cell pumping, so you are removing chlorides, and then H and Cl are being combined to produce various elements, and then H and Cl are removed when you return to the water to the ocean, while you have removed CO2 and you have compressed it. So the idea is you take it out of the ocean, you compress it, and move it somewhere where there is storage, geological, deep ocean, whatever other methods we have discussed. Okay, some data from the experiment: current density in milliamps per centimeter squared and cost in dollar per ton of CO2. You can see the electricity cost, the pumping cost, and the cell capex expenditure, capital expenditure, and what the total cost looks like, and where the optimum point is in terms of current density. Similarly, cost in dollar per ton of CO2 for electrode gap is also being calculated, and this is $1.56 per ton of CO2 in the whole in terms of pumping, cell capex, and cell electricity, which is much lower than many of the other numbers that are floating around, and MIT claims they can even make this more efficient and reduce the cost further. Of course, all these depend on what actually happens when they are implemented in the real world at scale to remove required amounts or economic amounts of CO2 to make them worthy of their claims. In the new system, seawater is passed through two chambers. The first uses reactive electrodes to release protons into the seawater, which acidifies the water, turning dissolved inorganic bicarbonates into carbon dioxide. So ocean doesn't store much CO2 directly. There is a lot of dissolved inorganic bicarbonates, which bubbles out and is collected using a vacuum and then compressed. Then the water is pushed through to a second set of cells with a reversed voltage, calling those protons back in and turning the acidic water back into alkaline before releasing it back into the sea, so that you don't reduce the capacity of the ocean to continue to take up CO2. Alkalinity is very critical for CO2 to get dissolved into ocean water from the atmosphere. Periodically, when the active electrode is depleted of protons, the polarity of the voltage is reversed, and the same reaction continues with water flowing in the opposite direction. So they are optimizing the two chambers on reversing voltage here and here, and when they're saturated, you just reverse the system and run the system backward. Sounds great, right? So hopefully this will work out. I just wanted to include it because it is a new exciting idea, and you expect MIT to do something grand anyways in the end. So let's wish them the best in terms of scaling this up and keeping the cost of carbon sequestration to a low level. Of course, there are other caveats we have to worry about, whether carbon capture means we can continue to burn more fossil fuels or continue our energy intensive lifestyle and so on, but we'll leave that aside for now. Okay.